Hello and welcome to So Much for Pathos, the show that sends Hollywood to bed without its supper. I'll be your detective, and today we're going to be travelling to where the wild things are. But before we head off on our voyage, we need to go over the case notes. Where the Wild Things Are is a 1963 children's picture book written and illustrated by Maurice Sendak. It consists only of 40 pages and 338 words, telling the story of a little boy called Max who, after causing havoc in his house, gets sent to his room by his mum without his dinner, effectively causing him to retreat into his imagination, where he travels to a jungle island to play with a group of fuzzy monsters who make up the wild things of the title. Whilst at first, according to Sendak, the book was initially banned and received negative reviews, children began to quickly flock to it, and over time the original negative viewpoint of its detractors became more relaxed, eventually starting to generate acclaim, which earned it the Caldecott Medal in 1964. A movie adaptation of the book had been in the works for quite a while before Spike Jonze got attached, dating as far back as the early 1980s, where the rights were in the hands of Disney, who had planned to put together a film which would place traditional cel-shaded animated characters onto computer-generated backdrops, a bit like what Treasure Planet ended up being, with Glenn Keane and John Lasseter to head up the project. Sadly though, nothing more than a visual effects test was created for the project before it was scrapped. Universal then managed to scoop up the rights, opting to go the fully CGI route with Disney animator Eric Goldberg as director, before Universal pulled the plug in 2003 in favour of a live-action adaptation with Spike Jonze behind the camera, a choice who Maurice Sendak found to be his personal favourite. Sendak went to task defending Spike against Universal over his approach to Sendak's material, which led to Universal making a turnaround deal to transfer the project over to Warner Brothers. In 2005, Spike Jonze and heartbreaking work of staggering genius author Dave Eggers completed a 118-page draft of the script adapting the book and headed into production on April of 2016, with Maurice Sendak acting as Jones's consultant all the way through the process. Sadly, when it saw its release on October 16th of 2009, even with wide critical praise and an eventual 73% on Rotten Tomatoes, Where the Wild Things Are financially flopped at the box office, breaking even only by $87,000 north of its $100 million budget. Which is a shame, because I'm proud to say that Where the Wild Things Are is one of my favourite movies, but in order to get to why, we need to investigate. Even though the book is relatively short and I was able to summarise the plot in its entirety in a single paragraph, we still need to go over the movie's expanded plot on the grounds that it makes some really interesting additions. Max, played by Max Records, is a lonely little boy, defined here by being highly imaginative and emotionally stubborn, yet prone to wild mood swings. He often finds it difficult to express himself properly, in part because his sister, played by Pepita Emmerichs, isn't interested in playing with him anymore. His mum, played by Catherine Keener, is being drawn away by work and the arrival of a new boyfriend, played by Mark Ruffalo, and his father, once present, is apparently now gone for good, although the movie leaves the precise details to the imagination. Max's inner frustration culminates when he, whilst wearing his wolf suit, gets into a shouting match with his mum and bites her on the shoulder. When she shouts at him, telling him that he's out of control, he gets scared of what he's done and runs away from home, eventually finding a small wooden boat by a river, where he travels across the sea to a mysterious island where he meets the Wild Things, who are effectively a band of cute yet dangerous monsters who are like-minded in Max's feelings that all they need is 24-hour fun and play, and so they decide to make Max their king, and over time it starts to become apparent that what they need is a more experienced and authoritative voice to guide them. In other words, a parent. Speaking of which, let's do the first things first. I feel the need to address the parents watching this video, so hello parents. According to history, you seem to have a fairly complicated relationship with this book. The film generated some mild controversy from concerned parents regarding whether or not it was harmful to expose children to frightening scenes, in a way echoing the controversy surrounding the book's original publication. This is by no means a unique situation, of course. Every parent faces the dilemma of how much of the frightening aspects of growing up to expose their children to, and how quickly. There's a difficult trade-off between preparing kids adequately for when childhood inevitably ends, and preserving the happy innocence of infancy for as long as possible, in as many ways as possible. Different people will have different takes on this, and the perception of what are and are not appropriate themes for a child of a given age will also vary massively from culture to culture. We can see this in film certification standards, for example, where American censors in particular are very sensitive to certain forms of bad language and sex, while surprisingly blasé about violent content compared to some other countries. So what exactly is it about Where the Wild Things Are that could potentially frighten children? Well, mostly when it comes to the picture book, parents seem to object to the design of the wild things themselves, deeming them too demonic looking, what with their sharp teeth, horns, claws and shit. Some children, thinking goes, could be unduly disturbed by the idea of a small boy being marooned on a strange shadowy world where he faces the imminent threat of being eaten up by furry giants. This same concern carries over into the film. The Wild Things threaten to eat Max on more than one occasion, and his crown is retrieved from a suspicious bone pile which they awkwardly try to dismiss. Aside from the physical danger, there's a compelling psychological narrative surrounding Max's terror and anger at his changing world as he edges towards his teens, with his difficulty understanding and coping with his own feelings leading him to making things difficult for himself and those who care about him. This tendency is reflected in the monsters themselves, who embody the neuroses, tantrums and insecurities of childhood, with Carol in particular mirroring Max's own inarticulate frustration and horror as the familiar certainties of his life inexorably change or vanish. These are challenging themes: change, mortality, and pain, and some parents might well feel that their children should not have to deal with them just yet, but of course, they will eventually. So might not a film with an uplifting message about accepting the upheavals of life and appreciating what a tough job your mother does keeping you steady through all of it be of some benefit to older children struggling to come to peace with a world which seems to get more complicated every day? Obviously enough, and it needs to be said, I have no place telling you what is or isn't good for your children. That would be foolish and wrong-headed of me. But my argument for films like Where the Wild Things Are is that they offer an honest and heartfelt look at how children experience and process external problems, and to deny them the ability to view such a portrait of themselves is to tacitly imply that children should be ashamed of their feelings, a viewpoint I wholeheartedly disagree with. I mean, don't let the accent fool you. Sendak often felt that the key to Where the Wild Things Are was that it was a story that respected children by being dangerous and which never talked down to them, and it's that key aspect that Spike Jonze's adaptation has lovingly preserved across its medium transfer. In Jones-Negger's script, the story remains the same but presents Max in a much greater emotional context for the narrative. To wit, Max is a small boy nearly on the verge of teenhood. His dad has probably left him, his older sister doesn't want to play with him anymore, work and a new boyfriend are keeping mum's attention away, and he learns in school that one day even the sun is going to die. Every solid, unchanging certainty his infant sense of security was based on is suddenly subject to the winds of change. In a sense, Max's biggest enemy isn't so much himself or his feelings, but rather the passage of time. He's smart enough at this point to know that his childhood isn't going to last forever, and him running away to presumably try and live with the wild things for the rest of his life, in a Peter Pan kind of way, is his angry and stubborn way of holding on to it. He's essentially an angry little boy who's been backed into a corner at the end of his childhood, his safe space, and he's decided to defend that space for as long as he can. What I really admire about Where the Wild Things Are in movie form is that even though it's a quietly told psychoanalytical tale about childhood anger, it dares to be melancholic in moments where it really counts, while still maintaining the book's weirdness as a story. In this context, the wild things of the title make up what amounts to elements of Max's childlike psyche, who similarly are prone to the same mood swings that Max is. Especially Carol, who becomes Max's best friend across the entire adventure, who rather than being a gigantic childish monster is more akin to a bumbling manic depressive. This is of course a more adult interpretation of the movie which children aren't necessarily going to pick up on immediately, but the best thing about Where the Wild Things Are is that its incarnation as a movie has the broadest possible appeal across all audiences, and I don't mean broad appeal in the shitty and cynical Hollywood marketing sense. Kids are destined to find endless fun as Max and the wild things scamper across the island, playing the biggest and most awesome version of dirt clod fighting and fort building they could possibly imagine, whilst their parents will find great psychological and emotional value in watching Max interact and play with creatures born of his own lonely and frustrated imagination. And if that sounds like a really difficult balancing act, that would be because it is. But it all works because the movie is really good at establishing and maintaining tone. Developing from Sendak's advice to not talk down to children, Where the Wild Things Are acknowledges that sometimes the story is going to be a bit frightening. But in order to remain consistent with the fun, frolicky moments and the rather melancholic moments, it needs to establish an internal logic that allows for such gear shifts that would otherwise feel rather jarring. To that end, the movie largely operates on dream logic, or rather, child logic, in that the characters make decisions that don't seem to make any sense or are contrary to previous thoughts and feelings expressed, and the landscape the story takes place on doesn't actually have much in the way of geographical consistency, seeing as it appears to take place in a location that has a beach, a mossy hill, a forest, a desert, and a cave system, all within walking distance between them. So there isn't much of an external logic as to why the place where the wild things are is the way that it is, but there is an internal emotional logic to the story, and like that of a child, it's not too caught up in the how and why of things happening, just that it is happening. Of course, this does all just sound like the movie is making excuses for itself, so it doesn't have to be strictly coherent, but as I stated previously, the context under which the movie presents itself makes this aspect work. The movie has characters changing their opinions on a dime and feeling angry or bitter for no rational reason whatsoever, and that'd be because the world of the story, and Max himself, much like all children really, are too often caught up in their own feelings to think through them. Structurally, the movie doesn't really have much going for it in terms of complexity. It's basically a simple adventure story centred around a band of characters whose personalities begin to unravel as we head towards the climax. What we do have, and this would be the main selling point of both versions of the story, is a sincere and emotionally tender look at childhood and friendship viewed through the filter of someone who's going through an intense period of emotional maturity. To that end, the film reminds me a lot of Charles Schulz's original Peanuts comic strips, in as much as it's a children's narrative at its core, but with enough thought and emotional integrity that adults can experience a striking insight into the emotional psyche of children that its target audience won't be privy to. In Peanuts, Charlie Brown deals with a lot of embarrassing childhood experiences, but what made it unique was that Charlie had an unusually adult-sounding voice, almost as if the strip was written from the perspective of an actual adult looking back. In a way, both Peanuts and Where the Wild Things Are complement each other nicely, in that whilst Peanuts was largely a strip about dealing with the difficulties of childhood from the perspective of an adult, Where the Wild Things Are is largely about dealing with the difficulties of transitioning to adulthood from the perspective of a child. And one of the best ways Where the Wild Things Are achieves this is by the addition of one simple but crucial plot element. And the best thing about it is that it's such a simple idea to the point where, upon reflection, it's actually kind of brilliant. In adaptation, the movie decides to present, along with the book's central message about how being a wild thing kind of gets old after a while, is the notion that Max begins to understand how hard it is to be a parent dealing with children who have attitude problems, namely Max himself.
You know what? You can't do that back to me. If we're upset, your job is not to get upset back at us. Our job is to be upset. If I get mad and want to eat you, then you have to say, oh, okay, you can eat me. I love you. Whatever makes you happy, Judith. That's what you're supposed to do!
See, Max is cast by the Wild Things as their king, or rather a guardian/authority figure, to look after the Wild Things and promise them no more pain and sorrow and infighting in the group. And whilst the story does end up travelling towards the tide trope of the liar's reveal, where it turns out Max isn't the king they thought he was, it still manages to stick the landing in the era of a poignant send-off for all the characters. By being able to experience what it's like being in a position of guardianship, Max is able to see how hard it is to look after people like him, and that his attitude problems aren't making anything easier. Made visible to Max by Carol's frequent outbursts, which accidentally bring the rest of the group down. And that's kind of the thing about Carol. It seems pretty clear to Max that that's what he'll turn into if he can't figure out how to deal with his feelings. When Max comes to the country of the Wild Things, the first person he sees is Carol. Carol was hurt that another Wild Thing, KW, has gone away, and is working out his inarticulate rage by smashing things whilst the other monsters complain or scold him. Seeing Carol's isolation and pain, which mirrors his own, Max cannot resist the urge to join in the destruction. Carol immediately likes him for helping, and they both seem to recognise a kindred spirit. Later, Carol carries Max and shows him around the island, and he seems to have developed into a kind of father figure, even duplicating what Max's real dad once said to him.
I can show you your kingdom. This is all yours. You're the owner of this world. Everything you see is yours.
At the same time, we see Carol's model world, where only the things he wanted to happen would happen, and Max decides to build the place for real. Relatively speaking, we're still inside a preteen's acid trip here. But Max's kingship puts him in a position of being responsible for everyone's happiness, and as their perfect fort fails to magically stop everything staying the way Carol wants it, namely stopping KW from playing with her other friends and making him jealous, Max sees how Carol acting out of control makes things harder for everyone, and even for himself.
And he loves you. You're his family.
It's hard being a family.
He's turned into a kind of surrogate parent figure for the monsters, especially Carol, and finds it impossible to stop him from self-destructing, driving KW away again, and hurting Douglas when he finds out that Max isn't a king and cannot stop change and fear and loss from happening. All this begins to suggest to Max that maybe he should try and deal with his feelings better, as well as what a difficult job his mum has.
I wish you guys had a mom.
And thus gives him the incentive to go home and say sorry to his mum, but not before giving a heartfelt goodbye to the Wild Things as he leaves on the boat he arrived in. It's a really simple and old type of story, really. Something bad has happened, and the only way for the world to be set right is for someone to do the right thing. In a sense, the entire story takes place within that moment where a child angrily stays in their room sulking about the thing they can't have, or the unreasonable argument they've had with whomever, before coming to the realisation that they've been really bad in the process of their needs, and the guilt that this realisation engenders becomes overwhelming. And it's in that moment that Max realises that he needs to go home, and that he needs to say sorry. And that's a relatable idea across both childhood and adulthood. We will always make mistakes, and we'll always feel bad about them, and the journey between feeling bad and making up for what we've done will always be a difficult one, but not insurmountable. That's what gives the Wild Things such power as an evocative metaphor. They'll always be there when you feel bad, engaging in endless play and indulging in their own feelings purely for their own sake. But at some point, play has to come to an end, and we go back to where we can perhaps start to fix things. Speaking as someone who suffers from depression on a daily basis and has his own anger issues, I can safely tell you that there is a wild thing in all of us. And that's okay. The ending to Where the Wild Things Are is particularly important, not just to me, but to many people. The story ends when Max eventually calms down, realises he feels lonely and that he's missing home, and travels back to his bedroom to notice that his dinner is still hot. It may seem like a small and simple thing, but it's a perfect ending to a story about childhood frustration, because to me, Where the Wild Things Are suggests that no matter how angry you are or how bad things get, there are people who care about you whatever happens, and that when you've calmed down and you need to come home, there'll always be someone waiting for you when you come back from that place you go when you need to be alone with your feelings. In a manner of speaking, your food will always be hot and waiting for you when you get back, and that place you go is where the wild things are. Regardless of who Where the Wild Things Are is aimed at, adults or children, it will always have a special place in my heart for its remarkable capacity to speak volumes to everyone. Where the Wild Things Are is a much remembered, much celebrated classic for a reason, and its 2009 film adaptation lovingly preserves that reason whilst not being afraid to expand upon its parameters and explore its ideas in closer detail. What results is a production that is as stunningly beautiful as it is remarkably tender, and it works because it's presented in a way that isn't at all manipulative, building its strongest character moments out of a surprising focus on naturalism, which results in a film that's sincere and uncalculated and has emotional beats that really hit home when they count. The Wild Things are brought to life by a marvellous combination of digital effects and Jim Henson puppet suits, as well as a series of tremendous performances to create tactile, real characters that join Max on his journey to emotional maturity. Maury Sendak's story of growing up with difficult feelings is forever accessible to children and adults of all ages, and its movie counterpart is exactly the same, managing to be as emotionally resonant as it was back in 1963. And it's for that reason that Where the Wild Things Are is one of my favourite movies. And on that note, I call it case closed. I'm Matt Crowley, and that was Where the Wild Things Are.